should have in your possession the sheet on figurative language. We're down on side 1. It's two-sided page. We're on side 1.2 down toward the bottom. And we were talking about interpretation of figurative language. And so that's about where we're at. I think we already discussed that one. Look for inspired interpretations. For example, in Acts 8, when Philip gives the interpretation of Isaiah's prophecy, Philip, being inspired by God, helps us to know exactly who Isaiah is talking about. So that's very helpful. We talked about that. I think that's where we left off last time. Another thing when you're trying to interpret figurative language is don't look for too many points of analogy. Sometimes we get bogged down in details, especially on parables. And we're what does this mean? What does that mean? And usually a parable is designed to teach one specific truth. And other things are side points and most of the time not that relevant to the overall message. So we get bogged down sometimes in all the details instead of trying to see the main point. And one example I cited there was this very short parable in Matthew 13 and verse 33. It says, another parable he spoke to them, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leaven. Now, that's a short little parable. What's the main point of that whole thing?
Little leaven, hold on.
Yeah. It's the influence of the kingdom, but sometimes people get bogged. Why 3 measures?
Why 3 measures? Why not 4? Why not 5? And that's really irrelevant to understanding the point of the parable. And a lot of times that's done in all these parables, getting bogged down in the details. And we need to be careful and always remember that generally a parable is designed to teach one specific truth, and stick with that, and then we won't get too sidetracked. Now there's another thing that comes into play here, and I'll just cite, since it's linked to that passage we just looked at. Sometimes figures of speech have different applications. And I've told you that about words as well. When we were studying about words and determining the meanings of words, it's a gross mistake to take a word that means one thing over here and say it means the same thing everywhere it's used. That's not even done in everyday speech. And we talked about that. And it's also true with these figures in parables. You just said it, little leaven leavens the whole lump. Well, that has a good application and a bad application in the Bible. It doesn't always mean the same thing. And so here in this verse, Matthew 13:33, do you think it's good or bad?
That's good, yes, the growth of the kingdom and the influence
The kingdom has in the world. But then you go out to 1 Corinthians 5 and you got the exact same figure, but it's used in a negative way. When the church at Corinth had the man who was having sexual relations with his stepmother, and he warned them there in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6. He says, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Now notice that it's the same exact figure about the use of leaven, the influence of leaven. But in Matthew 13, it was a good thing. You want the leaven to influence because it's the leaven of the kingdom. In 1 Corinthians 5, that leaven influence is not good. A little leaven of sin will soon leaven the whole church, is the idea. So keep in mind that figures can have different applications in different passages. Now another one that pops in my head while I'm thinking about that is the figure of sowing and reaping. In the literal sense, of course, that's a farming thing. Farmers sow in the spring and reap in the fall or in the harvest, and that becomes a figure for a lot of different things in the Bible. For example, whatsoever a man sows,
that shall he also reap.
And he's talking there about the life we live, sowing to the flesh, reaping corruption, or sowing to the Spirit, reaping life everlasting. But it has other applications as well. For example, in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul was talking about support of an evangelist, and he says in verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things to you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? Now you see, it's the same figure, sowing and reaping, but a completely different application. In Galatians 5, sowing to the flesh and reaping corruption, sowing to the Spirit, reaping everlasting life. Here, it's sowing spiritual things, the gospel, and reaping financial rewards for doing so. So it's the idea of support for the gospel preacher. But I just wanted you to see how that same figure can have different meanings in different contexts. It's a big mistake to take a figure and say it means the same thing everywhere it's used. Same thing with words that we discussed earlier. Take a word, say, well, it means the same thing everywhere it's used. That's just simply not true. It's not true in everyday life, and it's not true in the Bible as well. Questions or comments?
Jesus also told them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees.
And that's a bad
uses
sense.
leaven in of their teaching being
Yes,
dangerous.
he was speaking of the doctrine of the Pharisees, that's right. So there's you might say, a third application there, talking about doctrine and not so much lifestyle. So notice the different applications. That's important in interpreting figures. Don't always say a figure means the same thing every time you see it. That's just simply not true. Now, a lot of times in parables, and a parable is a figure of speech, by the way. It's a big story. It's an extended figure of speech. But a lot of times one figure will explain another. And Luke 15 is a great example of that. Most of the time when we look at Luke 15, probably 9 times out of 10, we're looking at the what we call the prodigal son. But there's 3 parables in that chapter. And sometimes we forget that. But they're all linked. They're all linked together with a common theme. And the common theme is set up for us in verses 1 and 2. It says, all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to hear him. So Jesus is drawing crowds, but he's drawing crowds from the wrong crowd in the eyes of some people. In other words, he shouldn't be. So the next verse says, the Pharisees and the scribes complained, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Now, Jesus wasn't doing anything wrong, but they were trying to make wrong out of it. And I think we all understand that. But then in verse 3, he spoke this parable. And he actually spoke 3 parables. And they're all designed to answer that charge. This man receives sinners and eats with them. What are you doing that for? And of course, before we even read the parables, because you've already read them and you know the answer, why was he eating with sinners?
He came to heal.
He came to win those people.
You're not going to win sinners if you're not going around them. If you isolate yourself from sinners, you're not going to win them over. And so we learn something, by the way. You know, in some Bible passages it says don't associate. In another Bible passage it says do, like right here. And there has to be a reason for the difference. The Bible doesn't contradict itself. And we learn here an important principle. It's the intent of the association that matters. It's not the association in and of itself that's the problem. It's the intent. If the intent of the association is to do what Jesus did and to reach out and win their souls, then it's a good thing. And if the intent of the association is to kind of coddle them in their sins and say, oh, you're all right, that church shouldn't have withdrew from you or whatever, if that's your intent, then your association is evil with sinners, see? So a lot of times intent comes into play. Not anyway, the 3 parables, the first one, verse 4, man has 100 sheep and he loses one. Does he not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And that's what Jesus was doing by going among the sinners and eating with them. He was looking for that lost sheep that might be among the sinners. He's looking for that one, you see. And when he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders rejoicing. So that's parable number 1. It actually goes on down to verse 7. Then in verse 8, another parable. Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, for I found the piece which I lost. So there's parable number 2. Again, about lost things. The man seeking his lost sheep, the woman seeking her lost coin, and then the bigger parable in verse 11, the father seeking his lost son. His son that left and went to the far country of sin, and father waiting for his son to come home. And when his son came home, dad said, stay away from me, you're a wicked old sinner. Is that what dad did? He ran to him and embraced him, and he said, welcome home. And so the 3 parables here are all revolving around that theme and answering that charge. This man receives sinners and eats with them. He says, well, here's why. I'm looking for lost things. I'm looking for lost sinners. Just like that lost coin, just like that lost sheep, and just like that father who has a lost son, I'm looking for lost sinners. And so that's the answer to the charge.
31 and 32 says that the well don't need a physician, the sick do. That's what he says there.
Yeah, it's the well people don't need a doctor, it's the sick who need a doctor. And of course in that context, the sick is the
Sinner.
The sinner, yeah, the sinner, that's right.
See where I left off here. Oh, here's another one. Sometimes type and anti-type, and that's another form of figurative language in the Bible. Type and anti-type, that's not language we use all of the time, but it is a form of language. The Bible uses it a lot, and it is basically a picture of something. You've got something that happens in the Old Testament, and it becomes a picture of something in the New. And so it's almost like a form of prophecy. And one of the passages where we see that is in 1 Peter 3, where you have Noah's Ark and the flood as a type, and Noah's salvation is a type of our salvation. So you have type and anti-type. Where did I say? 1 Peter 3, verses 18 and following. He says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom he also went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient." Now he's identifying, by the way, in case you're wondering who the spirits in prison are, he's telling you right here who they are. They were formerly disobedient when the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah. So who are these spirits?
He just told you. They were sinners in the days of Noah. That's who those spirits in prison are. Yeah, he just told you who they are. And everybody says, who are the spirits in prison? He just told you who they are. So they're people who were disobedient during the days of Noah, while God was waiting for the ark to be prepared. It isn't stated in this passage, but does anybody know how long God waited? Yeah, 120, or I can't remember if it was 20 or 25, but yeah, it was like 120 years. And we get that from Genesis. That's where God says, "My spirit will not always strive with man, but his days will be 120 years. So God was waiting for that long while the ark is being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. Now there's the type. Okay? My New King James says this in verse 21, there's an anti-type. See that? You have type and anti-type. The type was Noah and the ark and the people that were saved. And the anti-type is baptism. So it's a figure here where something in the Old Testament becomes a picture of something in the New Testament. And he tells you there in verse 20, 8 souls. We know from other passages. Who were those 8 souls?
His sons and their wives.
Yeah, Noah and his wife, his son, his 3 sons and their wives. That's 8. There's a whole world. Those are the only people who survived.
Okay. But they were saved. Notice what he says. Does he say saved by the ark? Not here.
Yeah.
Now, we could argue that they were saved by the ark, but that's not what he says here because he's making a different point. They were saved by water. Saved by water. How in the world did water save them?
Understanding it says through water.
Yeah, through, yeah. How did water save them?
Floated the boat.
That's right, it floated the boat. They were all inside
The ark and the water, and get the picture. The same water that killed everybody else saved the people in the ark because they're in the ark of safety and it's made of wood and it's lifted up and all the destruction is underneath. So water becomes the line of demarcation between the good and the evil. Those who were good were in the ark, and the water saved them, lifting up the ark above the destruction. Those who were evil were outside the ark, and the water destroyed them. But notice the line, saved by water. People say, water never saved anybody. Well, it saved Noah and his family. It saved Noah and his family.
Yeah, that brings us to the next verse. There's an anti-type. Here's the other side of the picture, which now
Saves us. Baptism. Now, question. What kind of baptism is he talking about? Look at the context.
water. They saved by water. Baptism. What kind of baptism? Water baptism. Because that if you take it out of water, you destroy the whole figure. You destroy the whole
Picture. So, just as Noah and his family were saved by water, we're saved by water. Not that there's magical power in the water, and he goes on to explain that. It's not that there's magical power in the water, but it's an act of
Obedience.
It's an act of obedience, or perhaps more appropriately, an act of faith. Both are correct, but it's an act of faith. You're trusting in God. So,
there's an antitype which saves us, baptism. People today say baptism doesn't save. Well, yeah, it does. The Bible says it does, right there. It does save us. And he says, not the removal of the filth of the flesh. In other words, it's not just taking a bath. It's not like the sins well up on your skin and you jump in the water and scrub the sins off. It's not that. It's not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but instead of that, the answer of a good conscience toward God. If God says be baptized and you want to have a clear conscience, what are you going to do?
You're going to be baptized. And if you're not baptized,
You don't have a clear conscience about that. You'll be making excuses. Well, I don't think it's necessary, or I don't want to, or whatever. But the answer of a good conscience toward God. So there's type and anti-type, a lot of times considered together in the same figure. And that's actually helpful when they are considered together, because then you don't have to guess about it. Because he links it. Peter links those two things right there. Questions, comments up to this point?
all right, turn your pages over. And we'll talk about
Different kinds of figures, specifically. We've been talking in very broad and general terms about figures of speech, but they all have names. There is an entire book, and I don't have a copy of it. I've thought about buying one, but I never have done it. It's called E.M. Bullinger's Figures of the Bible, and it's about that thick. And he gets into, you talk about some detail, he gets into some detail about figures of speech in the Bible. And I don't know how many different ones there are, but I've listed, I think, 19 right here. And I'm sure there's probably more than that. But I've listed at least 19 different kinds of figures. Now, you don't have to know the names of these figures to go to heaven. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. You don't have to understand the names of these figures. But I think for interpretive purposes, it helps us to know that. And it helps us to recognize one when we see it. So that's why I'm doing this. It's worth the effort on the part of a student of the Bible. And you are all students of the Bible, at least you should be. And so it's worth the effort to do this. Even if you don't remember this, after we go through this and you forget all those names, that's okay. Just as long as you learn that they do have names and they are identifiable, and this is a figure and that's a figure. This is the main thing you really want to pull out of all this, is how to identify figurative language and how to interpret it. Okay. So one of the first ones, and we sort of touched on it already, is, if it'll come up, there, a parable. And a parable, the Greek word, parabolo, is the Greek word, so it's almost a transliteration, letter for letter, from Greek into English. And para means beside, or next to. And balo means to throw. I'm talking about the Greek word. So parabolo is to throw beside. So a comparison, this laid beside of this, so you can look at the similarities and differences. And that's what a parable is. And the Lord throws out something. Behold, a sower goes forth to sow. And he's laying that beside another truth to illustrate and picture the truth. And so one thing compared to another. Sometimes I like to just put the prefix C-O-M in front of the word parable. Comparable, because that's really what it is. It's a comparison, comparing one thing to another. And in that parable of the sower, what is Jesus comparing there?
Well, he's comparing souls of men to the hearts of men to souls in the ground,
Yeah.
and whether or not they'll receive the seed and give forth fruit.
Yes.
And people can understand that because they farmed or been around
Yes.
it. They understand you can sow the same bean seed or corn seed on some ground and get nothing. And you can sow it in another place and it produce good. They can understand it.
Yeah, it's something that's easily graspable.
Graspable and understandable by the common person, especially in that culture. Nearly everybody farmed in that area of the world, and almost everybody made their living in some form or fashion with farming or something related to it. And so Jesus would use, and by the way, get that when it comes down to teaching. The simpler the better. Try to break it down as much as you can. Now, we know there are things in the Bible hard to be understood. Peter said so. But try to break these things down as simple as you can. You know, I've heard preachers that can stand up there and talk over people's heads, and that's not much count. Use words that are that long and not tell you what they mean, and then use about 15 of them in 2 or 3 sentences, and then everybody's lost. And that doesn't help anybody. So parables, there's a lesson in there for us. Make it simple. Look how Jesus made it simple. And so the sower, he goes to sow, and there's different kinds of soil. There's the wayside soil, which is the hard, packed down soil. There's the thorny soil, which is cluttered. It's cluttered with thorns, and that chokes out the word, chokes out the seed. And then there is the What's the other one? The stony?
Stony.
The stony, which is the heart that's shallow, because the stony ground is
Shallow. You don't have much earth there for the seed to take root. And then there's the good ground, where the seed really takes root and really produces a crop. And he's describing, as you said, the different kinds of men. Some people's hearts are hard. They're not going to listen to a thing the Bible says. They don't care. Some people's hearts are crowded. The cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches. Their hearts are crowded. Some people's hearts are shallow. They'll latch onto the gospel today, and then tomorrow, the first time some little trial comes their way, they're done with God. Well, I thought I became a Christian. I thought everything was going to be hunky-dory from now on, and here I am going through another trial, and they give up. And we need to learn that trials come. That's part of life. And you can't be someone who has no depth and no root and just waste away when the first little hardship comes along. You can't be that way. But that's the different kinds of hearts of men. And so that's a parable. And it's a figure of speech. When Jesus said a sower goes forth to sow, even though he's using a literal thing, he's not teaching a literal truth. He's using it to teach the spiritual truth about sowing the Word of God. And by the way, one more thing, and we've mentioned this before, where did he sow the seed?
everywhere. And, it's not up to us to decide, well, he's got a hard heart, and I'm not going to talk to him, or he's got a stony heart, and I'm not going to talk. That's not up to us. Just sow it. Sow. Teach. Throw it out there, and let the seed do the job. God will separate people in his way with his word. He'll separate those people. Don't you size them up ahead of time and then deny them the opportunity to hear the word. Sow that seed. Okay. Another figure of speech is an allegory. And it's similar to a parable, but it's a little bit more of a complex comparison. There's an allegory in Galatians 4. I think we may have touched on this once before, briefly in another class. But before I read all this, the theme of Galatians is the difference between the two covenants, the old and the new. And the Judaizing Christians were trying to bind the law of Moses on Christians. And Paul is basically saying you can't do that, okay? And so that's the background of the book of Galatians. So for chapter 4, verse 21, he goes into this allegory. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? It is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman, the other by a free. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, he who was of the free woman through promise. Which things are symbolic? That's what my New King James says. Anybody have an Old King James? Allegory. These things are an allegory. And that's really what this figure of speech is called. And it's like a parable in a way, but it's kind of extended, it's more complex. So he's dealing with something literal to start with. Abraham had two sons. Abraham was real. We read about him in the book of Genesis. He had two sons. He actually had more than two sons. He had some of the sons of Keturah also in Genesis, I think, 25. But he's talking about the two main sons here. And who were they?
Ishmael and Isaac.
Yeah, Ishmael and Isaac. So Abraham had two sons, one by a bondwoman. That would be Ishmael. The other by a free woman. That's Isaac. Now, who was the free woman? Sarah. And the other woman was Hagar. Okay.
He was born of the bondwoman, was born according to the flesh. He of the free woman through promise. Which things are symbolic or an allegory? I'm going to take that truth and I'm going to make an allegory out of it. Okay. For these are the two covenants. For the purposes of my allegory, these two sons are the two covenants. And what would be the names of those two covenants as we know them today?
Yeah, Old and New Covenant, that's right.
These are the two covenants. One from Mount Sinai. Well, what came from Mount Sinai?
The law.
The Old Testament, yeah. The Old Testament, Ten Commandments, the law
Law of Moses, that's right. One from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. Okay. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the Jerusalem which now is. That's earthly Jerusalem. Okay. And is in bondage with her children. Bondage of sin, of course. But the Jerusalem above, above, what does he mean by above?
Heaven. There's the heavenly Jerusalem. That's right. The Hebrew writer spoke of that. The heavenly Jerusalem. That's where the capital
Of the church is today, up there in heaven, the heavenly Jerusalem. Free, the mother of us all. For it is written, And he quotes the scripture here from the Old Testament. Rejoice, O barren. Who was the barren woman?
Sarah. She was barren, couldn't have kids, but God opened up her womb so she could have Isaac. And so, rejoice, O barren,
You who do not bear, break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate, you, Sarah, has many more children than she who has a husband. So God opened her womb. She had Isaac, and Isaac had
Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. The 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 sons of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, which became the 12 tribes of Israel, which became the nation of Israel.
Okay. So that's how she has many more children. And not only that, but she has spiritual children, all those in Christ. We're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Verse 28, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise, we being Christians. Okay. But as he who was born according to the flesh then, back then in the Bible, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, Ishmael persecuted Isaac. They didn't like each other, and their mothers didn't get along. What does the scripture say? What was God's solution when he found out that Sarah and Hagar wasn't getting along?
Cast out the bondwoman. Get rid of Hagar. She got to go.
Cast out the bondwoman. And in keeping with his allegory, the bondwoman corresponds to
the Old Testament. Cast out the bondwoman. Old Testament gone. We're not under that law.
That's the whole point of this allegory. Cast out the bondwoman. Cast out the old covenant with her son. For the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we, Christians, are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. We're children of Abraham. Yes, even us, spiritually speaking. Children of Abraham. If anyone belongs to Christ, he's Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So that's an allegory. It's an extended and more complicated figure. It's a little bit more complicated than a parable. You know how simple a parable was. We think about the sower goes forth to sow. That was very simple. This one's a little bit more extended and a little bit more complicated. But if you spend a little time, you can kind of get the point, the gist of what he's driving at. So it's just one more argument he makes to show the difference between the two covenants. A fable. Now this one's interesting. I'm looking at the clock, see how much time I got. A fable. Anybody ever heard of Aesop's fables? They used to have when I was a kid, they used to have a cartoon. I think it played on Sundays, Aesop's fables. And they used cartoon form to teach some of those old fables. But in a fable,
there's something interesting
happen. Animals can talk. And plants and trees can talk. And in a fable, human qualities are given to animals and plants. And it becomes a figure. Aesop's fables were a way of teaching moral truths and lessons from history and things like this. And so the Bible sometimes uses fable. And there's a great example of this in the book of Judges, chapter 9. Judges, while you're turning back over there, and we may have to finish this up next week. I'm looking at the clock and the time's running low, but the book of Judges was a dark time in Israel's history. If you just read through it, you'd just be amazed at how, we think things are so bad right now. Just take a trip through the book of Judges and see how wicked things were. And I've told you the other day, things go in cycles. We think they just get worse and worse and worse and worse. They don't. They go in cycles. There's cycles of bad and there's cycles of good, and it's always been that way. And the book of Judges is an excellent illustration of that. It was a dark time in Israel's history. But there was this judge named Abimelech. He wasn't a judge, but he wanted to be. And verse 1, Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal. Jerubbaal was the judge before him, and that was his father. And he went to Shechem, his son went to Shechem to his mother's brothers and spoke with them and to all his family of the house of his mother's father, saying, please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you? Because Jerubbaal had 70 sons, so he's gone, and now you're going to have all 70 of his sons reign over you, or that one reign over you, namely me. I want to be your king. Remember that I am your own flesh and bone. We're related. We're kinfolk. So this is what he wants, okay? And he works out an agreement where they say, yeah, that makes sense. We don't want 70 kings. We'll just have one king. We'll make you the king, okay? So he gets, in order to put himself in as king, I got to kill those 70 brothers, or those 70 sons of Jerubbaal. So he kills them all on one stone. That's mentioned later in the text. Verse 5. He went to his father's house at Orpha and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. So I assume that means he bashed their head in on the stone, I guess. But he killed the 70 sons of Jerubbaal on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son, was left. So actually he killed 69, if you want to take that statement at face value. The youngest son, Jotham, was left because he hid himself. He saw what was coming and he hid. So he's still alive. One of the sons is still alive. And verse 7, when they told Jotham, he went and stood at the top of Mount Gerizim, and he lifted his voice and he cried out and he said, "You men of Shechem, listen to me, that God may listen to you." And here it is. Here is the fable. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them. Trees
Don't need a king, do they? Not in the literal sense. This is
a fable, but it's designed to teach a truth, okay? And I see the time has passed. We'll come back to this next week. You might want to study in that and take a good look at that for next Wednesday night, and we'll look at that fable a little bit more closely.